Hey, how's everybody doing tonight? Thursday night, 7 p.m., ready to go. Um, got something different tonight. Tonight I wanted to go over some bits that are super fresh. I mean, I worked on these last night and sent the build in later today. Had a lot of questions about Azure Functions, and it's been probably, I don't know, it's probably been 3 or 4 months since I've taken a look at Azure Functions. They iterate, the last time I looked at it, they had just released version 2 of the runtime. Now they have version 3, and version 3 has quite a few additions. They've integrated a lot of things, they've made the build better. Most importantly for me, because it's all about me, is that the core tools version 3 actually work. So on a Mac, I'm actually able now to build, test, and deploy from my Mac. So I know this isn't a big deal for a lot of people who just push publish in Visual Studio, but for me, having a command line environment where I can actually build, test, deploy, pretty big deal for me. So MassTransit has support for Azure Functions. It's had it for a while, and it's trying to go through the various iterations of it. The thing I want to focus on now are, and the reason for the grind last night of getting these bits out is Azure Functions now supports dependency injection. So a lot of the generic host has been ported over to where the runtime now runs on the host builder, and it all runs on top of ASP.NET. So they've really moved in the way that the ASP.NET team is working, and this is just based on my spelunking through the code and figuring out how it all works under the hood, because there's a lot of bindings. You used to have to pass a bunch of arguments on the function method to do anything, and that's always been kind of problematic because you end up with this big argument list, and you have to essentially, the way MassTransit did it before is it was a lot like using a new bus instance for every function call, because that binder would come in and that's how we communicated back to the bus. With the new way of building the application and having the host, and with all the container work that had been done in MassTransit, I thought it would be really cool to just kind of take advantage of that, let you add your consumers, and then on a per queue basis or per entity basis, because it works with subscriptions as well, go out and make it so that you could just run MassTransit in an Azure function and have it triggered by the Azure function runtime. So you get the advantage of that consumption model pricing when you're running .NET services in Azure Functions, yet you get the same capabilities as MassTransit has when it runs as a bus. So I did put an initial documentation page out there. It's still scarce. I don't know why I haven't done a better job of documenting each transport, but that's on me. But I did write out and just kind of put the sample code here. The sample code that's in the source code repository is linked, and I believe that links to the Azure Functions source code sample. And this will build with version 3. So it does work. You can build and deploy it. I'm going to walk through that tonight because I think that's really cool. I just merged my pull request earlier today. I thought I had done it, but anyway, it's all good. So code's in there. I also have a separate sample that I'm going to run through tonight, but just to kind of give you a feel of what it's like. So I'm going to open up the project, which I've already created because I didn't want to spend a whole lot of time doing it, because honestly, function development is like 90% cut and paste, and then the rest of it is just like anything else. So it's a little strange, but I'm going to start off with the CS proj. This is a .NET Core 3.1 app. It uses Azure Function version 3. The MassTransit WebJobs Azure Service Bus NuGet package is used, and you can see I'm using the latest, greatest develop that was just built right after I merged the PR. I'm also referencing a couple of Microsoft Azure Functions types, including the FunctionsNet SDK. For the item groups, to deploy a function, you have to have two things. One to deploy it and another to test it locally. I actually pushed my local settings to the server on Azure, but I want to go over that real quick too. So the host JSON, pretty simple. It configures application insights. A lot of the defaults are exactly what you're going to need. The log level, I set the log level to debug for MassTransit so we can see when MassTransit is doing what it does inside the runtime. And then I set the extension service bus, which configures the Azure function triggers. So because Azure Functions is doing the invocation of the consumers, we need to tell it what the prefetch count is. We're telling it to autocomplete because we're letting Azure Functions deal with the message receiver. MassTransit doesn't do any sort of receive endpoint setup for it. Functions handles that, and that's how it does its auto scaling and instance management and all of that. So any sort of prefetch counter match concurrent calls, stuff that you would normally configure on a receive endpoint with MassTransit with Azure Service Bus, you're going to want to configure in here. That auto renew duration, that's that auto lock retry. So whatever your lock time is for your queue, you'll want to set that auto renew duration to whatever time you expect your functions to run. If you're running 30 minutes in a function, that feels really painful to me, but I've seen people do it. So I'm not the one to judge. It's just what you got to do. For the local settings, this is where you're going to need a lot of connection strings. When I did a .NET, I think I did a Func new project, and I'll walk through that as just kind of a sample as well, using the core tools. But it created this local settings file for me, and I've put things in here like my Azure storage account, the connection string to my Azure Service Bus, the App Insights telemetry key, the fact that I'm using the extension version 3, all of that stuff is in the local settings file. So that's the host in the local settings file, project file. Now let's look at how we set this up. So much like an ASP.NET application, you now have a startup class that's a function startup that you can register with your assembly. So you can see the assembly function startup. I've told it that Twitch project.startup is my class, and I'm overriding the configure method so that I can add things like, I'm adding application insights telemetry. It's added by default by the function's runtime, but I'm trying to figure out why it isn't getting my dependency stuff. So that's just in there. I could take that out. I don't have to have it. I'm adding scoped my submit order trigger, because that's the trigger that I have that's going to be my class that is created. And I'm creating that scoped because I want it to be created within that Azure Function runtime scope. So it creates a scope for that request or that message. And so I'm wanting it to take advantage of that. I also have a new method here called AddMassTransitForAzureFunctions. This is a lot like AddMassTransit, except it has a whole bunch of stuff under the covers for it. In essence, you're just going to add your consumers to it just like you would AddMassTransit. You don't have to configure the bus. You don't have to configure any of that because that's all taken care of under the covers. I might add some configuration options for that later, but for now, that's what there. It sets up the Azure message scheduler so that messages that are scheduled can be scheduled through the NQ time on the queues. So that all still works. I can just bring this up real quick. All it is a bunch of boilerplate for setting up the code, configuring the bus, and then configuring and capturing some of the configuration information so that we can create those per entity receive endpoints that aren't really endpoints, but they're managed by Azure Functions. And this actually worked out cool. And this is kind of what got me fired up over this whole thing is I'm actually, by the way I'm using the configuration here, and this is getting down into the guts, but I'm actually able to graft an Azure Function transport into an existing bus with a service bus transport. So it's able to take advantage of all of the publish, send endpoint capabilities of MassTransit, including configuring all the topology. So now when you publish events or send messages from an Azure function with MassTransit, it's going to configure those queues, configure the topology, configure that stuff for you. The one thing I can't do is I can't create the queues for you for the receive endpoints. And the reason is Azure Functions, if you try to start one up and the queue entity doesn't exist yet, it will blow up and it just won't bind your function. So that's something that you can continue to create a separate service that has the receive endpoint queue names if you want to use deploy topology or use like a resource manager script or something like that to deploy as part of your Azure Functions. So just a look under the covers, I was pretty stoked about it, pretty thrilled. The submit order consumer that I have, it's just a standard MassTransit consumer that you would write for Mediator, that you would write for a bus instance, anything. Same capabilities. I can inject iLogger to it. I can use it. I can write log information out. I can publish messages just as I've always done. Yeah, so that's pretty cool. The trigger is interesting. The trigger has two different methods in it, and I wanted to show both queue and subscription endpoint type capabilities. So previously in old versions of functions, you had to create a static class with static methods. There was no way to do dependency injection. There was no lifetime scope. There was nothing. I mean, you were basically just providing a static method that was called. Now things have come a long way, so it's pretty exciting. So now when you create a trigger, you actually take a dependency on iMessageReceiver, which I renamed and didn't even think about. It used to be called provider. Naming things, one of the hardest things in software development. Good names. And the message receiver has a handle function, which, why wouldn't it be an iMessage handler then? Yes, thank you very much. That inconsistency just hasn't escaped me at all, but that's the method that's been on that thing forever. So who am I to rename it? Just the author of the library. But I don't like to break stuff, so it doesn't matter. But this really will break stuff. So if you're porting functions over from an older version, this new way is going to be a lot cleaner, I think, compared to what we had before. Because it used to be just nuts. Binder, logger, nuts. Yeah, crazy. So now it's really cleaned up the individual triggers. So like submit order, it has a service bus trigger. It takes the queue name, which this queue name is Twitch function. Service bus is going to pass the message to us. It's already read it. And it's going to give us a cancellation token. We're just going to take that and we're going to say handle it. We're going to pass the queue name so it knows which receiver to send it through, the message and a cancellation token, and we're done. That's it. That's going to dispatch it to that receiver within MassTransit for Azure Service Bus messages. I also created another one here that's actually listening to a topic and a subscription. So it's taking and essentially doing what MassTransit would call a subscription endpoint. It's putting a message receiver on that subscription on that topic. And then by formatting that subscription and path, I'm passing the entity path to the receiver and saying, handle this one. Exact same way of doing it. Now with the way this is set up, both of those consumers will be configured on those receivers for those endpoints. So whichever receiver it is, it doesn't matter. The messages, submit order, order submitted, they're just within the messages namespace. I have a simple little client over here that we're going to use to feed messages into this. Yeah, so it's going to be fun. I'm going to show all of this through the console. So first I want to bring up a couple of websites, and if I had the ability to create links in the websites, that would be great, but I don't, or in the video. But working with the Azure Function tools, here, I'll post it in the chat. See if that works, yeah. So the Azure Function core tools, I'm on a Mac, so I installed them with Homebrew. I think it's different depending upon which OS you're on, but I just did Azure Functions core tools at 3. I did have to install the AZ CLI, which is the Azure command line interface for all of that, and I had to do a login so that it downloaded my publishing profile and stuff like that. But other than that, it works just like any other command line tools for .NET and Azure, except I think it's written in Python, which is totally cool. So what I had originally done is I had just done this func init my project. I told it .NET. It created the git ignore, the host, the local settings, created the initial files. It put some weird stuff in a VS Code folder. I just got rid of that because I don't use VS Code. And yeah, that's all I did. And then I started adding code to this based on cut and paste from what I had seen on the internet. There actually is a little bit of documentation on this. I will give some credit there. It wasn't easy. I'm not going to lie. It was a lot of trial and error, but like the dependency injection page in the documentation talks about how to build a startup function. It's a little shady on what you can do because it seems like a very trivial use case, but that and digging through the source code, I was kind of able to figure out what goes on there, how it manages with service lifetimes. Yeah, so I can go out to the command line and I can just do func start, and it will build that actual project, fire up the Azure Function Core Tools runtime, and actually start running that locally. Now, fortunately or unfortunately, I guess it really doesn't matter. See, now it's got a host log. It actually thinks it's running. It's cool. It's talking to the services out there in Azure land. I do have up on Azure, I have this function configured. So if you look within your resources, you have the ability to create a function app. I created mine using, how do I know what settings this thing has? Function apps. It has like the ability to show me some settings. What do we have in here? My resources. Of course, I click away from it, and now I'll never find it again. How am I not seeing it? There it is, MassTransit Twitch. Okay, so here it kind of shows some things. It shows my subscription, the URL that it runs on, the pricing plan, which is whatever that is, consumption-based. It is running on Linux. They do have a Linux-based consumption plan now, but you can't do it with a Docker container. It basically puts you into a full VM with that. So I didn't do that. But if I look at the function app settings, I can see I've pushed this stuff up. You can see it's configured for version 3. Read-only, master default. I think those are different things. I don't know what they do. Again, I really don't know what they do. I have a bunch of application settings in here. I pushed my local settings when I published, so I didn't have to recreate them. So that worked pretty well. And I have my two functions that are up here, my submit order function and my order submitted function. Both of those are within that same class, but it's come in and it's configured the bindings, and you can see sort of how the order submitted, Twitch observer, subscription name, all that's there. Twitch project.dll and the entry point name, so it creates all that. Kind of cool. It does seem like under the covers it's just a lot of plumbing. I'm trying to figure out how I could make it to where with the AddMassTransitFunctions, if you just add all your consumers, it creates function methods for you and auto binds them. That would be really cool. Like configure endpoints would be like configure functions, but that's going to require a lot more than just looking at the code for a while to figure out. But that would be really cool in my opinion. So I'm going to test this. I'm going to go out to my console app here. I have this little client out here. I came out here because I want to try to stop this. I'm not sure how to stop it. I don't know if it's even possible. I can turn it off. Yeah, so let's kill that. Let's kill that. Hopefully it won't take it down on my test machine. Find out if that's the case. Looks like it's still there. Okay, so I'm going to my client. Why is this here? I don't do this. Yeah, so just do a .NET run here, and it will send a message to that queue. Oh, okay, good. So it finally picked it up. You can see it says starting mass transit, so it's actually creating an instance of the bus. It pulls the connection string out of the function options. There's a service bus options type that gets added to the container, so it pulls that out, so it now discovers the connection string that you're using, so it knows how to connect to it. And it uses that connection string to actually create its own connection to Azure Service Bus. You can see where function runtime is executing that function with the different trigger details. The green messages are actually from MassTransit. So they're the debug messages, and you can see it's configuring both of those consumers on the Twitch function endpoint that received that message. The consumer itself is writing out these log messages of the correlation IDs. And that's the nice thing about doing it this way, is now when you're responding or publishing or anything like that, the conversation IDs, the correlation IDs, all of that stuff within the consume and send context headers gets transferred over, so you have that nice message continuity. It's going to publish the event. You can see it's creating a topic client to publish message order submitted. Then you see as soon as it sends that message to the order submitted, the other trigger function kicks off, because again, the Azure Function Runtime is handling this. So then it goes and runs that other function. That function is order submitted, the executed order submitted, the submit order function. Both of those run. Basically, we know both of those ran. Here's the send that actually completed to that order submitted queue. It was actually starting to be received before the send log gets written. That's just timing. The other Twitch function read, and it was the, what's the consumer there? Somewhere. The submitted function, yeah. Yeah, order submitted. That's the log message from the other consumer. And you can see that the correlation IDs line up. It was initiated by that correlation ID and they match. And they both have the same conversation ID. And the order ID matches. And that's all handled in the runtime. I could kick off a whole bunch of these. I made it so I could just hit enter to send a whole bunch, which I thought was fun. Crank that up a bit. Resize that. Yep. Yeah, and it's been in the background crunching through these messages, kicking through them. Because they're running local on my machine, they should be capturing some data, but it isn't running up in the runtime. So I can Control-C this. It's going to clean up. You can see it's stopping mass transit. It adds itself and gets disposed. It adds a disposable token to the container, so when the container gets disposed, it auto stops the bus. I tried to do a hosted service with this, and that's one thing I found out with Azure Functions. It does not like you to register a hosted service because it expects the first one retrieved from the container to be its own, and it blows up if it doesn't. So it isn't like ASP.NET where you can add like 6 hosted services. It only allows 1 right now, so I haven't figured out a way around that. So I added a disposable to the container that will auto start the bus, and then on the first function call, and then kill it when the container is disposed for the process. So that seems to work pretty well. So that's that thing. So I wanted to just come in and kind of like create a couple of changes here. Like I want to get rid of this annoying duplicate log message because I know where it came from. And those are log informations from mass transit. If I want to look at my other order submitted consumer, I have the order submitted, and that's the ID. The one other thing I wanted to do is show one other capability. So and it's in the sample that I have. So with the order submitted consumer, right now I can't configure, the question comes up is how do I configure middleware on this thing? So I'm going to create a order submitted consumer definition. And I'm going to call, that's a consumer definition for order submitted consumer. What did I completely do wrong? Why is this just completely freaked out? Like my editor went sideways for a second. Okay, we're back now. Great, awesome. So if I wanted to configure middleware on the consumer, like if I wanted to say endpoint configurator dot use message retry, let's say I just wanted to do an immediate retry twice, just to handle any temporary outages. I could add that order submitted consumer definition. I could go over to my startup. I could say add computer order consider computer, comma type of order submitted consumer definition. And now I'll use that definition on that to configure that endpoint. So it will apply that message retry middleware. So that's how you would add middleware to these. And you can also still do any endpoint settings you make aren't going to make a lot of difference because the endpoint names are defined by the function, but middleware components will be configured in there. The other thing I wanted to show is that within the function, so right now I'm just calling handle, which is going to just register all consumers on that based on the name that's passed to it. I wanted to go ahead and change that a little bit. I wanted to be able to say like handle consumer and submit order consumer. And by specifying that consumer name, it will only configure that consumer on that endpoint. So it makes it a little quicker. It eliminates a lot of the extra stuff that would otherwise be configured on that endpoint. And that's really the main benefit. It also makes it so you can have a whole bunch of consumers registered with mass transit, but just configure the ones you need on the various functions so you don't get like weird overlap and stuff. It also makes it so it works with activities, so you can actually register an activity and have a function for the execute and a function for the compensate, and they'll all run in functions. It's a pain because you got to configure it all yourself because you have to create the queues, but it does make it so that you can run routing slips on Azure Functions now without too much pain. So I can change and add this order submitted consumer here, and it'll basically just change those so that it will configure those endpoints just with those consumers. yeah, so when I want to build that, so I could run this and test it again, I could just say func start and it'll go out and build it and verify that it's up and running. I could then go back over to my test app, give me a couple messages here. You can see that they're all firing off. It started the bus, it created the namespace, it executed the functions, called submit order. All that stuff is just working. It works reasonably quick. I mean, especially for a low consumption thing, it's probably going to be plenty fine. I think it runs great. So we'll close out of that. When I want to publish this, I don't know if I have publish in my back buffer. I don't, dang it. I think it was just func publish. Wait, hold on. Let me check the docs before I blow something up. So deploy, I want to say that there was like a, of course, you know, they want you to do like, you can do Git deployments, you can deploy repos, you can do all this stuff there. That's stuff that I, found to be pretty well documented. The trick for me was actually just deploying it with the Azure tools. And I think I had to actually find that in the Azure Core Tools documentation. It wasn't in the main documentation. And I want to say, and I'm sorry for scrolling here. Let's see here, publish. Publish the project to Azure. So the publish to Azure, I just typed func Azure function app publish and my app name, which is the name of that container that I was running in, which was MassTransit Twitch. I would just say MassTransit Twitch, and this will let me publish the latest version up there. It'll do its thing for a second, it'll build it, it'll zip it up, and it'll upload that zip package to the publishing site. It goes pretty quick. As deployment completed successfully, you'll see it update the triggers. If I had told it to push local settings, it would sync the settings on the server with what my local settings were. Now if I go out here and look, it should be redeploying that function. I'll turn those on. Make sure I don't have it running locally, which I know I don't because I just published it. So once that goes in there, and I'm fairly sure that's in here, we can monitor these. It does show you like the execution. So you can see earlier tonight when I was making sure that things were going to work, I was getting a bunch of different runs. I'm just going to go right back out here to my test app. I'm going to send a few messages. My local app isn't going to pick it up anymore. And it does take a few minutes for it to refresh out here. It is logging this data to App Insights. So if I go over to App Insights and hit refresh, we can see the ones that I ran 3 minutes ago are here. You can see the disconnect, close namespace manager, all of this stuff, the order submitted, function executed. There is some weirdness with the tracing right now, and that's what I can't figure out. I can't figure out if App Insights is actually logging telemetry or just logs. I know it's doing logs because I see these information. And I know it's doing some request tracing, and if I look at the timeline, I can see that the message hit the queue. And this is the message I published because MassTransit build is the namespace. So it hit the queue, it sat in the queue for 858 milliseconds, and then the function ran in 103 milliseconds. So it has some level of tracing. It just isn't getting us that full trace. So I'm not sure. I don't think it's doing the full telemetry. I think it's just doing logging. So I got to figure that out yet. And if anybody has any ideas on there, that would be awesome. But again, like the submit order function, I can see that I published it, and I can see that the time spent in the queue was there. So I'm uncertain as to how that all wires together. And I don't know if that's just differences in trace formats or what. It seems like everything's kind of under development in that area is probably the best way I could phrase it. So I don't know that we're going to wait for this to show up. Let's see here. 5 minutes. We're still 23:28. Oh, 23:28. Yeah, so that was just now. So this looks like ones that were probably ran back then. But we can see it gives us a little log message. I can go do the query in App Insights and get all the data. Everything that you can do is there. If we look here, it says any recent ones. order submitted messages. So yeah, that's kind of the new the new Azure Functions support that MassTransit has. I think it's a lot cleaner. I'd like some feedback on it. I definitely think it's more usable. The fact that you can use DI and you can inject things in. I'm gonna have to try to figure out how to host a Saga in it and get my database connection out there to Cosmos or something like that, just to see if I'm able to do that. You can add multiple triggers. If you go to the example that's in the MassTransit repo, I'm not going to show this right now. I mean, I guess I could. I mean, there's no reason I couldn't. In fact, I would. If I go over to that sample, I had it running in here. Let's see if it still runs. And we have time. We can give it a peek. Let's see if that function actually starts up. So all I did was go into that samples directory. If you clone the MassTransit repo, just go in there and type func start. It should build it and run it, and it can be running the function locally. Apparently, I already had a message in the queue, the input queue, because it just got up and started running. So that was cool. But you can see it picked up the topic, order accepted, order received. Yeah, sample Azure Functions Service Bus order receive, and that was actually published events that I connected the consumer for. I will say one of the kind of cool things about the function support is MassTransit doesn't have a transport for Event Hub, but if you're using Azure Functions, you can create an Event Hub trigger and actually send those Event Hub messages through MassTransit. So if you look at this sample, you can see that the audit order functions are actually an Event Hub trigger, and that Event Hub looks at audit order, and it's the audit order consumer that comes in on the input hub. So if I go back to my client app, and I guess I deleted the Event Hub sender code, but I still had it in here. Yeah, I don't have the code to do that right now, but the just sending that message through Event Hub, or sending a whole bunch of messages through Event Hub, you're able to pick those up and actually get those through a function on Event Hub. And then any messages that are published or sent from that Event Hub consumer will go out through Azure Service Bus. So you're able to basically look at an incoming stream of data and then dispatch that through, you know, a back-end system that's going to use those messages. So yeah. So anyway, that's just kind of a bonus feature there. It's in the GitHub repo. It's linked in the documentation. So if you're looking at the Azure Service Bus documentation, you look at the link for source sample code, it will take you to that sample within the repo. Plenty of stuff to cut and paste from and try to get it up and running. It is using version 3 of the Azure Functions, so make sure when you create your resource group in the portal or using a resource manager script that you pick the correct type, because otherwise it will not work. Oh, yeah, here's the latest ones that I just ran. Yeah, these are the ones that I just fired up. Yeah, if I go out to App Insights now, maybe those will be there. And if I look at the search results and I refresh, I should have some from like 00 something. Yeah, 731. Still not the right dependencies though, I don't think. Yeah, I mean, we're doing the gets and we're saying the right thing, but I'm just not seeing all the data. These are just the ones that are logged by Service Bus, so it's not picking up MassTransit's diagnostic source, and I haven't figured out why yet, because I'm telling it to, but it doesn't seem to be taking the config. Because then you will get like all the consumer telemetry and everything that you get with MassTransit. So that's enough for tonight. Hopefully this was useful. Definitely check it out. Check out the bits. They aren't mainstream yet. They are in the pre-release branch, so you'd have to pull down the latest develop. I expect this to come out sometime soon, probably as a 6.3. I broke some things, but it's a minor enough feature that I'm not going to worry too much about revving a major version. But yeah, so that's tonight's episode. Hope you enjoyed it. Thanks for joining. Catch you later.